Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our first webinar in our series called Out in the Country. Tonight, we will be covering LGBTQ foundations. So this evening, we'll be covering 6 different areas. So this is how our presentation will be laid out tonight. So we'll be covering gender and sexual diversity. We'll look at what that means. We'll be looking at the LGBTQ2+ acronym. We'll be doing a bit of a deeper dive into trans and non-binary community, looking at gender neutral language and pronouns. We'll be covering some language tips, and then we'll be ending with some history around LGBTQ folks in Canada. So gender and sexual diversity, so what is it? Some of you, this might be a brand new term for, some of you might already know what it is. So gender and sexual diversity are often just called sexual diversity. Refers to the diversity of all the sex characteristics, sexual orientations, gender identities, without the need to specify the identities and behaviors and characteristics. So a lot of folks will say when they're talking about this space, they will say LGBTQ. So you will say like race and ethnicity, disability, and then LGBTQ. Another way of replacing that an acronym is saying gender and sexual diversity, because it's all about diversity within gender and sexuality. And then there's 3 kind of main components that this is made up of. So there's sex, which is the biological traits that society associates with being male or female. So in other words, what's between your legs. There's gender, which a lot of times gets applied because of what someone's sex is. And gender is cultural meanings attached to being masculine or feminine, and which can influence someone's personality. And what it means by cultural meanings is a lot of times we think of gender as being man or woman, but in some non-Western cultures, there are more than just a man or woman gender, and we'll explore that a little bit more. And then the third piece is sexuality. So it's your sexual attraction, practice, and identity, which may or may not align with your sex and your gender. So what does this all look like for a person and their identity? So again, gender and sexual diversity encompasses quite a few things. So gender identity, or sometimes just called your gender, is a person's sense of self in relation to their gender. So that typically means you are a man, you're a woman, you're non-binary. It's what gender you identify as. Gender expression is how a person presents themselves, styles their actions, what they wear, how they style their hair, that kind of thing. Again, sex is also sometimes called sex at birth or gender at birth, because again, what's between your legs sometimes dictates your gender. So it's sex is what's between someone's legs or their genitals. And then there's sexual orientation, which is your sexuality, so who you're sexually attracted to. And then we're gonna talk about romantic orientation, which is a lot of the times it is encompassed within sexual orientation, but we're gonna break it apart and I'll explain why. So we're gonna go through all 5 of these pieces together. So as I mentioned, gender identity is one's innermost concept of self as male, female, a blend, or both, and sometimes even neither of them. So it's how individuals perceive themselves and what they call themselves. So one's gender identity can be the same, or it can be different than what sex they're assigned at birth. So if you've ever heard the term gender binary, that encompasses a man or a woman. And that can be a cisgender man or transgender man, and we're going to explore what those terms mean later on. And then there's also non-binary, or sometimes called gender non-conforming. So these are the 3 kind of groups, and they can be broken down individually even more, that gender identity kind of fits into. And as I mentioned, gender a lot of times fits in with culture. So in every society, gender comes with something that's called a gender role. So it's the role or behavior learned by a person as appropriate to their gender. So a lot of the times in Western culture, gender roles are typically women are staying at home, taking care of the kids, and men are out working. We know that is not the case in modern times, or it shouldn't be at least. So gender identity is what someone presents as. So gender expression, also sometimes called gender presentation, is how a person publicly expresses or presents their gender. So this can include anything from the way they dress, their hair, their makeup, their body language, their voice. A person's chosen name or their pronouns are also common ways of expressing gender. And gender expression is often a way others perceive a person's gender through all these different attributes. So gender expression is typically thought of in one of three categories. So something that is masculine, something that is feminine, or something that is androgynous, which means it pulls from male and female. So sometimes androgynous can be a little more masculine or it can be a little more feminine. So as I said, society is very gendered. So what does society tell us about gender expression? This probably isn't a surprise to anyone, but society typically tells us that girls and women wear dresses and skirts, they have long hair and wear makeup, they express themselves as caring and feminine. And then society typically tells us the boys and men wear shirts and pants, they have short hair, they don't wear makeup, and they express themselves as strong and masculine people. However, what is wrong with a caring man in a dress, and what is wrong with a strong woman with short hair? There not only are LGBTQ folks challenging these stereotypes and these gender norms, but a lot of straight cisgender folks are as well. So a super common gender expression news item that occurred in the past year was my friend here, Harry Styles, who on the cover of Vanity Fair magazine wore this dress and wore other dresses. And there's a really big conversation in the world around what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to have gender expression? Because it's what is wrong with Harry Styles, who identifies, or sorry, what is Harry Styles is a man, and what is wrong with him wearing a dress? So that's something to think of when you're seeing things that you would normally describe as more of a masculine or feminine thing, and you're seeing it on someone that you wouldn't think. Why are you questioning that? So as I mentioned, sex or sex of birth is the anatomy of a person. So when you're born, the doctor will typically look at a baby and say it's a boy or it's a girl. So this one, a lot of folks usually think is pretty straightforward in terms of what it is, but there is actually a third piece within sex, which we'll talk about later on, which is called intersex. So intersex translates to between the sexes. So again, we'll talk about that later on. So again, sex it's just a label that's based on the genitals and what chromosomes you have. It's something that goes on your birth certificate. And as I mentioned, in our society, our sex often dictates our gender and then our gender roles. Hence why it's also sometimes called gender at birth, even though gender and sex are different. The next one is sexual orientation. So this one most folks do have an understanding of. So sexual orientation or sexuality is a person's identity in relation to the gender or genders in which they are sexually attracted to. So some of the more common sexual orientations that folks may or may not be aware of are straight, gay, lesbian, bisexual, pansexual, asexual, and queer. And we'll be exploring all of those later on in this presentation. So as I mentioned, I wanted to break out romantic orientation away from sexual orientation, and I'll explain why in a second. So similar to sexual orientation, romantic orientation indicates what gender or genders a person is attracted to. But in this case, it's all about romantic attraction, so who they can fall in love with. So in this example, Ken, in blue, is a bisexual man. He is sexually attracted to both men and women, but when it comes to who he actually has a romantic attraction to, in other words, who he falls in love with, he only experiences romantic attraction to women and not men. This means Ken is heteroromantic, which is his romantic orientation, and bisexual, which is his sexual orientation. So again, a lot of times we will group romantic orientation within sexuality or sexual orientation. just because it's simpler. But for a lot of folks who are do have an attraction to multiple orientations, it does get a little tricky because in Ken's case, a lot of folks who might not understand LGBTQ issues will say, okay, Ken's only romantically attracted to women, so they will only ever see him dating women. So in that case, someone might say, oh, Ken's straight, Ken's not with men, but it doesn't matter who Ken is with, Ken will always be bisexual. You just got to validate the fact that when someone says what the orientation or sexual orientation is, or the romantic orientation is, that is what it is. So how do we compare sexual orientation or romantic orientation? So I put together this chart. So with most things within gender and sexual diversity, they all start with similar prefixes. So hetero and homo are two of the more common ones. So hetero being attracted to different sex or gender, homo being attracted to the same, bi meaning more than one. So historically, bi meant two, but there is a narrative that's now changing it to mean more than one. And we'll chat about that a little bit later on. Pan means regardless of sex or gender, so everyone. Demi, A, and gray are some newer terms that folks typically come across. Demi is only experiences attraction after a strong emotional bond. A does not experience any attraction, and gray only occasionally experiences attraction. So if you take these prefixes and add them to the word sexual or romantic, that's where you get the sexual orientation of the romantic orientation names. So for example, someone who only has a sexual attraction to someone after they have a strong emotional bond is demisexual. Someone who is attracted to, so someone like myself who identifies as gay, so I am both sexually and romantically attracted to men. So I can say I'm gay, I can say I'm homosexual, I can also say I am romantic. So I can use all those terms. Sometimes some folks use romantic orientation, some folks don't. And the reason why in this chart there's red color rows and yellow color rows is sometimes folks will identify with something in red and something in yellow. So for instance, if someone identifies as pansexual, maybe it doesn't matter what sex or gender someone is, but they also identify as demisexual because they only are attracted to someone after that strong emotional bond. And I also just want to point out, this is not an exhaustive list, and identities, again, as I mentioned earlier, are unique and may vary depending on the person. So again, gender identity, gender expression, romantic orientation, sexual orientation, and sex, they all overlap, they all work with each other, but they are also separate things. So whenever you're talking to someone and someone says, this is my sexual orientation versus this is my gender identity, make sure you understand what that means if you're in a capacity that you're trying to support them. Just ask too. It doesn't hurt to say, hey, what do you mean by trans versus LGBTQ? And again, we'll be covering a bunch of that later on. Which is the correct acronym to use? LGBT, LGBTTIA, LGBTIQQ, all of these. I'm not getting you to vote on this one because there's so many variations, so many options, but just think to yourself, what is the most accurate version of the acronym to use? Trick question, there is no right answer. So different organizations, different people, different members of the LGBTQ2+ community and non will advocate for a different version of this acronym, both in terms of the letters and the order of those letters. And all of those reasons for their advocating are valid. They all have different purposes and meanings of why someone will use a certain version of an acronym, but it's important to remember that including every single acronym is next to impossible because there's so many different identities out there. And a lot of times there's new conversations happening both in the advocacy world and the academic world, and new identities are being created. So that's why a lot of times you will see a plus sign on the end. Part of the reason why, this is also part of the reason why there's a movement towards using a single term, like the term queer, or rainbow community, or other terms like that, to replace an acronym. Because again, an acronym, or the acronym, can be used so many different ways, and so many people stress about what version do I use. So we'll be talking about specifically the term queer later on. So throughout this presentation, I will be using LGBTQ2+. I may verbally slip up and say a different version of it, or I might purposely use a different version of it if I'm referring to only specific folks. So for instance, if I'm only referring to lesbian, gay, and bisexual folks, I will only say LGB instead of the larger acronym. The reason why I'm using this version of the acronym is this is the official version that is used by the government of Canada. So whether you are looking for which acronym to use for yourself or for an organization that you work for, a tip is just adopt one version and stick with it for consistency. As I mentioned, I sit on the committee, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee at my work. And we created an inclusive language guide, which kind of has all of our rules and guidelines around diversity and inclusion language. So we adopted the Government of Canada's version of the acronym. So then that way all of our employees are using the same one. So we have consistency. However, if you are using one version, make sure that you are listening to gender and sexually diverse people around you. And if you're getting folks saying, hey, you should really be using this other version of the acronym, listen to it. They have a reason for it, and whether you switch or not is up to you, whether a person or an organization, but make sure you're listening to folks. So now we're going to go through the LGBTQ2+ acronym and look at those identities. For anyone who is interested, on the left-hand side, behind each of the little characters, there is a flag, and those flags do represent each community that I'm talking about. So for example, on this page, that flag is the lesbian flag. So a lot of folks will refer back to these pride flags, but each individual community also has their own flags as well. So starting off within the acronym, so L for lesbian. So lesbian is a woman who is attracted to another woman. A related term that I want folks to learn is gynosexuality. So this refers to someone who has an attraction to a feminine personality. So the person doesn't have to be a woman to have a feminine personality. And gynosexuals are attracted to those who have a feminine personality, including men, women, and non-binary folks. So, so someone could be a lesbian, someone could identify as pansexual or just queer in general. But if you're attracted to femininity, this is a term that may or may not apply to you. And then similar to lesbian, gay as probably the most common term, a man who's attracted to men. And then the related term for this is androsexuality. So similar to the previous, androsexuals are attracted to anyone with a masculine personality. So this includes men, it includes women and non-binary folks who present masculinely. And the person doesn't have to be a man to have a masculine personality. So it's just an attraction to basically manlyhood versus womanhood. So bisexual and pansexual. So these are two terms that often get confused and overlap. So bisexual, most folks have a previous understanding that it means two, so bi meaning two. So however, there is a new narrative going around that bisexual is people who are attracted to more than one gender, but possibly not all genders, but possibly it could be all genders. And then pansexual is a similar term, which means someone whose attraction is not dependent on gender. So again, gender identity can be a man, it can be a woman, it can be non-binary, trans folks. So pansexual folks, it doesn't matter. Or bisexual, it may or may not matter. So it's important to know that one of these terms is not better or more inclusive than the other one. Someone might identify as one of two of these for a variety of reasons. Could be historically or just the historical relevance of bisexuality. Maybe it's a older adult like a senior who just that's what they've always identified as, so they're not going to change it, even though they fit the or the pansexual definition better. It could just be they prefer a certain term. There's a variety of reasons. And then for folks who are interested, for the flags, the bisexual flag is the pink, purple, and blue on the left, and the pansexual flag is the pink, yellow, and blue on the right. So trans or transgender. So trans, we're going to explore a little bit more in depth a little bit later on. But trans is somebody whose biology does not align with their gender that they were assigned. So someone who was born as a woman, who is now a man, is transgender, or vice versa. So so cisgender is someone whose biology aligns with the gender they were assigned at birth. So I, for instance, am a cisgender man, meaning I was born with the sex organs of a man, and I identify as a man, therefore I am cisgendered or cis. Another term is non-binary, which again we'll explore later on. So it's an umbrella term that does have some overlap with the transgender community, and non-binary is a gender that's outside the binary of a man or a woman. So some folks who are trans also identify as non-binary, and some non-binary folks identify as trans. So a lot of folks, folks will fit into one of these three categories, if you will, and we'll explore trans and non-binary later on. So as I mentioned, we're going to chat about the term queer. So in this acronym, version of the acronym, queer can stand for questioning, which is, as it sounds, it's folks who are questioning what their sexuality or gender identity is. But most commonly, it is queer. So historically, queer has been an insult, but it has now been reclaimed by younger generations to being a positive term. And it's basically just means someone who is not cisgendered, which again is someone who is born, who identifies as the sex that they were born, and also someone who is not straight. One of the nice things about an umbrella term like queer is that it can be used both as the collective term as well as an identity. So for example, you can say I am LGBTQ plus or whatever variation in the acronym. That can be replaced with I am queer because it's also that umbrella term. Or you could say I am insert any sexuality or no sexuality. You can replace that with I am queer. So it's a lot of folks don't like defining what they are. So again, as I mentioned with the bisexual and pansexual slide, some folks might not be able to choose what definition fits them better, or maybe they just don't care what box they kind of tick, but they do want to identify in some capacity, so they will choose the word queer. I do want to just flag that if you are planning on using the word queer, whether personally or as an organization, use it with caution, because as I mentioned, there's a lot of historical historical issues with the term queer, as it was the slur that was used against the LGBTQ community back in the day, and still is in some cases used today. So for a lot of older folks and seniors, this is a term that still has a lot of extremely painful memories, and even when they hear it today, it still brings up a lot of negativity. So as I mentioned, I work for a research institute for aging. So in that inclusive language guide I mentioned, we have specifically that we will not use the word queer, just because we work with older adults and seniors, and we don't want to trigger anyone. That being said, if we had a staff member who identifies as queer, we will for sure recognize that person's identity, but as a public-facing organization, we're just avoiding that just because of who we serve. So two-spirit. So this is one that a lot of folks are learning now, as it's now being put on to the end. So Typically on versions of the acronym, it will be 2S. Why the government of Canada has only put a 2 and not a 2S, I have no idea. It's just what they have done, what I have copied. So pretend it's 2S if you want. So 2S, again, spelt with a number or spelt out, is a term used only by Indigenous peoples. And it can be used rather than or in addition to LGBTQ. So Two-Spirit acknowledges the pre-colonial gender and sexuality norms of Indigenous peoples. So what that means is I mentioned earlier that gender can be different for different cultures. So Western cultures have this binary. So again, a man and a woman. But before the Europeans came to Turtle Island or North America, Two-Spirit folk or Indigenous folks recognized different genders, and every First Nation has a different definition and a variety of definitions for Two-Spirit folks. Two-Spirit is an umbrella term because it encompasses so many different things. And so as this point is, each individual LGBTQ plus Indigenous person may have their own way of expressing what Two-Spirit means to them, and not every LGBTQ2 plus Indigenous person uses the term Two-Spirit. So back on that land acknowledgement slide, I also used the word or the term indigiqueer. So that is taking the term queer, which again, as we just talked about, is an umbrella term or can be an umbrella term or a specific identity, and just adding the word indigi or from Indigenous in front of it. So it's some folks, so again, some Indigenous folks might identify as Two-Spirit, some might be indigiqueer, some might be LGBTQ2 plus, and maybe a combination or none. Again, it's all up to the person, and it's all unique. So just historically, I like history, so I'm just gonna do a little bit of history lesson here. So the Two-Spirit term, again, being an umbrella term, it came out of the Native American gay and lesbian gathering held in 1990 in Winnipeg to solve the problem of naming. So again, as I mentioned, each First Nation in North America had all these different words and to define their different genders. And so there was this issue of what term do we call all of these, even within one nation, let alone all the different First Nations across Turtle Island. So Two-Spirit was the name that they chose. So historically, a lot of folks, Indigenous folks, did not identify as Two-Spirit, but a lot of folks were turning to identifying as Two-Spirit if they so choose so, as a way to reclaim their Indigenous culture from colonization. And on the left, there's two examples of Two-Spirit flags as well. So sometimes in the acronym, there's a term there you will see an I. So I refers to intersex. So there's a big debate going on right now about whether intersex is part of the LGBTQ2 plus community or identity or not. So intersex, as I mentioned earlier on in the gender slide, on the sex slide. So sex is about what's between your legs. So if you have male genitalia or female genitalia. And what intersex means is it's a general term, so it's another umbrella term that is used for a variety of different conditions in which a person is born with reproductive or sexual anatomy that doesn't fit that typical definition of female or male genitalia. So intersex folks can appear to have one type of gender genitalia on the outside and another on the inside. Some have XX chromosomes, some have XY chromosomes, some have ambiguous genitalia, meaning, again, it doesn't fit that definition of male or female. And it's a broad term that has been around actually since the 1700s, and it means between the sexes. So intersex is as common as being a redhead or a ginger. So it's not this rare thing. It's actually quite common amongst people. So historically and still in present day, intersex folks experience quite a bit of shame. The derogatory term hermaphrodite, if you ever heard that, I've never really understood what context it's used in. That's the derogatory term that is used against intersex folks. And intersex folks experience forced and non-consensual surgeries, including on babies. things have started to change slightly since the 1990s when the intersex movement began. However, today in Canada, intersex folks have no recognition of rights to physical integrity or bodily autonomy, and no specific protections from discrimination on the basis of sex characteristics. So if you look at this from a science and psychological point of view, every research paper you will ever read on intersex will say there is nothing wrong with being intersex. But from a psychological standpoint, there's nothing wrong. If there are no health complications from the genitalia or having both or parts of different reproductive systems, then why are we going in to alter this on babies? So that's the conversation around this. Intersex could be its whole own presentation, and I encourage folks to look into it. So ally, sorry, I'm just looking at the time here. So ally, so this is another term. So ally or straight ally is a straight or cisgender person who supports LGBTQ issues. It's important to note that ally should not be a noun, it should be a verb, meaning it's not some title you achieve, it's a constant action that you're doing. So this is kind of a tip. So always center the impacted and the marginalized, so always put the LGBTQ folks first. Listen and learn from those who live in oppression, leverage your privilege as a cis straight person, and always yield the floor. So always give the floor to folks. So why deeper dive into trans and non-binary folks? So when we look at all the different programming, the supports, the health services, the hate crime stats, we as a society do a decent job at supporting lesbian and gay folks. But when it comes to supporting the teens of the trans folks and the non-binary folks, there's a lot of lacking support to it. So as I mentioned, so trans folks are someone who their biology does not align with the gender that they were assigned at birth. But it is also important to recognize that not all trans people want a surgery. So if someone was born a woman and is now a man, they might not want to do anything with their breasts or other reproductive parts. And you should never ask whether someone has undergone any kind of surgery, whether it's an actual surgery or hormone therapy. And a lot of times transgender folks get asked the questions, or the question, what is between your legs? That is a huge red flag. Do not ask that. Two terms that are related to transgender community is AFAB or AMAB, or you can say them out, or just say AFAB or an AMAB. So this is assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. So as it's written here, when someone is born, the doctor will say it's a boy or it's a girl. So instead of saying you are, historically it's been FTM, so female to male. So that narrative has now been changed to assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. I also just want to point out for anyone who is looking to learn more about the trans community, there are several trans celebrities now who are quite vocal. Whether you want to view them as role models or not, there's one person in here I personally don't view as a role model for the trans community, but they're still someone who stands in the spotlight as a trans person. So these are some folks that I really recommend looking into their personal stories and all they've done for the trans community. So non-binary, so this is a newer concept for a lot of folks, especially in rural Ontario. So non-binary is an umbrella term meaning someone that is outside that binary of a man or a woman. So a lot of people think that non-binary means androgynous, which again means not necessarily male or female, and kind of that in between or that unknown, if you will. But that's not necessarily the case with folks. Some non-binary people use the term trans to describe themselves as they transitioned from male or female to this third gender or being non-binary. Non-binary folks don't neatly fit into categories of man or woman. Excuse me. And some examples can be some people have a gender that blends elements of being a man or a woman. Some people have a gender that is different than either male or female. Some people don't identify with either gender, and some people's gender changes over time. So these definitions can be agender, which someone who doesn't have gender, Bigender, someone with two genders that may or may not occur at the same time. Demi-boy or demi-girl, so someone who partially but not completely identifies with being male or female. Gender fluid, someone whose gender identity changes over time, so it fluctuates between being more masculine or feminine. Gender queer, so referring to anyone whose gender is queer or queering of that gender. And then masc femme, so terms used to refer to people whose expression leans towards a binary gender, so again, male or female, but who do not identify as that gender. So again, there's quite a few non-binary celebrities that have come out. Some of these folks you may or may not know are non-binary. So Jonathan Van Ness from the Netflix show Queer Eye, one of my favorite people, non-binary. Miley Cyrus is gender fluid, which again, meaning her gender fluctuates between being more feminine and masculine, which again, as I said, most people will look at someone like Miley Cyrus and say, oh, that is a woman, but that is not who she is. She is gender fluid. Even though she might present herself more on the feminine side, she herself feels more on the masculine side at times. Sam Smith and then Alex Newell. Alex is from Glee. If you're having some trouble recognizing that face, so Alex identifies as gender nonconforming, which is another way to say non-binary. So there is overlap between trans and non-binary. So non-binary and transgender are two large identities with large areas of overlap, but not all non-binary people identify as trans, and not all trans people identify as non-binary. Some non-binary people would say that they're neither transgender or cisgender. Non-binary people may identify as trans because no one is assigned as non-binary at birth. So again, the doctor will never pick up a baby and say it's non-binary. It will always be it's a boy, it's a girl. So that's why some non-binary folks will identify as trans. And you don't have to have gender dysphoria to be trans. And some non-binary people experience dysphoria and choose to pursue some aspect of medical transition. So those who are unaware, gender dysphoria refers to the psychological distress about not being in the right gender. So if you are a woman but you have a penis, that is going to give you a lot of or it may cause you some psychological distress, and that's when you have gender dysphoria. And some folks will go out and get medical surgery for that. For anyone who is interested in learning more information about trans and non-binary folks, Trans Wellness Ontario, they have just rebranded and switched their mandate from Waterloo, Essex area to Ontario. So they are a great organization that you can learn more and get support from. I also recommend this, and I feel like I should get commission for it. Disclosure on Netflix is an amazing documentary that looks at how trans folks are represented in Hollywood, both historically and present day. It's a documentary that absolutely changed my mind and just really made me realize I'm not doing enough to support the trans community or knowing enough about the trans community. So I really recommend watching it if anyone has Netflix. So gender neutral language. So what is it? It's language that avoids bias towards a particular sex or social gender. So it includes the use of nouns that are not gender specific to refer to things like roles or professions, formation of phrases, discounting blanket and discounting blanket terms of male terms. So as you can see on this chart in the first column, these are some professions. So this I feel most folks have more or less switched to. So switching terms like fireman and policeman to firefighter or police officer, switching terms like man-made and manpower to terms like artificial or homemade, and workforce and staff. An important one is about relationships. So not everyone has a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a wife or a husband, and that's not just for gay and bisexual folks. Again, as we talked about for trans or for non-binary folks, they're not a boyfriend or a girlfriend. So there is no term for that. So partner or spouse is that gender neutral word to use that encompasses boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, etc. You can still refer to someone as your boyfriend, girlfriend, or husband, but when it's that unknown and you're trying to use a blanket term, use partner instead of boyfriend slash girlfriend, or spouse instead of wife slash husband. Partner is the more universal term, so partner can include spouse. So just think about that when using it. A lot of times you'll read something and it's you'll have something like he or she or he or him or her or him. Just switch that language to they. So a lot of times folks will think they is only a plural pronoun, but it's not. It can be singular as well, and we'll talk about that in a second. You can also just put person instead of he or him, or sorry, he or she. And then this one, I've been historically really bad doing. So walking into a room of friends or colleagues and saying, hey guys, what's up? Or hey guys, what are you up to? Sometimes hey ladies as well. So obviously not everyone identifies as a guy or a lady. So switch that to the things like hey folks, hey friends, hey everyone, say y'all. We're rural Ontario, I feel like that's applicable. So just be aware of what kind of language you're using, and don't be offended if someone calls you out and saying, hey, don't use hey guys, use hey friends. Just be aware that there's a reason why someone may or may not be calling you out on that. So gender pronouns, what are they? So gender pronouns are words that people use to refer to others without using their name. So this is something that we learn in English class in school with he and him and she and her. So Sally went to the store to buy herself some snacks. Fred went to the store to buy himself some snacks. And then Ash went to the store to buy themselves some snacks. So as I mentioned, they and them, although we are a lot of times taught that it is a plural, it can be a singular term, both in terms of gender pronouns and even in typical English. If you start thinking about how many times you say them or they in a singular form, you'll actually be surprised. So by using person's pronouns correctly, that's the important part, using them correctly, other people are showing them respect and forming an inclusive environment. A 2016 study, and there's many other studies as well, have found that affirming a person's pronouns and an extension their gender lowers depression and raises self-esteem. A person affirming another's pronouns can help others feel comfortable with their external appearance and their gender identity. And probably one of the most important stats that I will cover in all three of these webinars is transgender and non-binary youth who have their pronouns respected by most people in their lives are 50% less likely to attempt suicide. If that orange circle alone doesn't make you start using pronouns, I don't know what will. So have conversations with your workplace or your club or your associations about pronouns. Feel free to reach out to me if you want to learn more about how you apply them in your workplaces. I'm happy to chat. So I'll just quickly skip over this slide just for time, but if you just do a quick Google search about pronouns and how to use them, you'll find charts like this. So he, him, and she and her, again, are the binary, and a lot of folks typically use them or use them more often. So most folks know how to use them. But when it comes to some of the newer pronouns that folks use, like Z and here, those can be a little more tricky, but again, just do a Google search. And most importantly, if someone that you work with or you know uses pronouns that you're not sure how to use, just ask. People want their pronouns used correctly, so just ask them. It's also important that if someone is using multiple pronouns, so for example, if they use he, him, and they and them, make sure you're just interchanging them. So it's practice for you. It's also validating that person that they use multiple pronouns. So language tips with special guest, not actually guest, Chaz Bono. So for folks who don't know, Chaz Bono is American writer, musician, and actor. He's the son of Cher. Yes, that Cher. If you don't know who Cher is, that's on you. Chaz had famous parents, being Sonny and Cher, and had a career of his own and was well known in Hollywood before coming out as trans. Chaz came out as trans in 2008, 2009, had gender confirming surgery, in those years, and at the time was the most talked about trans person. In 2011, Chaz went on Dancing with the Stars, and at that time was the first openly transgender man to be on a major television network for something that wasn't about trans issues. So that was a big milestone in media. And again, watch that disclosure documentary I mentioned. Oops, oopsies. So when referring to a trans or non-binary person and they have changed their name or have different pronouns, never, ever, ever use their previous name. So Chaz is not the name that is on his birth certificate. As I've said, Chaz is a trans person and has changed their name. So their previous name is also called their dead name. So the name that no longer exists is dead. So never use that name and never refer to them as their previous pronouns. So I'm not even gonna mention dead names or use dead names or previous pronouns in this because it is misgendering, and as that previous slide talked about, misgendering causes a lot of issues. So just make sure that you're using the current pronouns and name that someone uses. When it comes to language, make sure that you're not using the word preference. This is a big thing that a lot of folks have used. I myself have used it to describe myself as a gay man. And it's so Chaz's preferred pronouns are he, him. They're not preferred, they are his pronouns. His pronouns aren't a choice. So his pronouns are he, him. Whoops, pretend the and they, them aren't there. So they are he, him. Chaz's sexual preference is women. He doesn't prefer women, he is sexually attracted to women, and his sexual orientation is straight. And Chaz doesn't identify as a man, Chaz is a man. So these are just kind of those things. It's not a preference or a choice, that kind of narrative that we talk about in the LGBTQ2 plus space. It's definitive things of it is sexual orientation, he is a man, these are his pronouns.